The stagecoach door swung open, and four brothers who had spent 3 months preparing separate rooms in one shared ranch house realized all at once, standing in the dust of Millbrook, Wyoming, that the four women stepping down were sisters. Nobody had mentioned that in the letters. Jedediah Voss was the eldest, 34 years old, and the one who had placed the first advertisement in the matrimonial paper, out of desperation more than romance. The Voss Ranch sat 11 miles outside town, 4,000 acres of grassland that took 4 men to run and not one woman to keep house for any of them. His brothers, Silas, Amos, and Bartholomew, had followed his lead within the month, each writing his own letter to the same agency in San Francisco, each expecting a stranger, each expecting, if he was honest with himself, someone entirely unconnected to the others. "That can't be right," Silas muttered beside him, watching the second woman step down and immediately take the hand of the first. "They're greeting each other like family." "They are family," said the driver, climbing down to unstrap the trunks. "Sisters, all four. The agency maxed them together on account of nobody wanting to separate them. Figured brothers marrying sisters made a tidier arrangement than scattering them across the territory." Jedediah felt something tighten in his chest that was not quite dread and not quite relief. He had written to a woman named Leanne Zoe, describing himself plainly, a rancher with more cattle than conversation, and had received back a letter so carefully worded, so patient in its honesty about the ocean she had crossed and the family she hoped to build a life near, that he had read it 4 times before sleeping. He had not expected that patience to arrive wearing the same traveling coat as 3 other women who shared her blood. The eldest of the 4, a woman with steady, dark eyes and hands that had clearly done more work than the delicate script of her letters suggested, stepped forward first. "You would be Jedediah," she said. It was not a question. "I am Leanne. This is my sister Yun, and my sisters Finn and Sue." "Ma'am," Jedediah said, removing his hat, though the word came out rougher than he intended. Behind him, his brothers stood in a rough line, each holding his hat the same way, each looking as though the ground had shifted under the ranch house they had spent a month preparing. Bartholomew, the youngest at 22, could not stop staring at the woman named Sue, who could not have been older than 19, and who returned his stare with an expression that suggested she found the whole arrangement as bewildering as he did. "There's been some confusion," Jedediah started, but Leanne cut him off, not unkindly, with the particular firmness of a woman who had crossed an ocean and did not intend to be waved off at the finish line. "There is no confusion, Mr. Voss. We came because our letters were answered honestly, and because staying where we were was no longer possible. If your family cannot accommodate 4 sisters, we will find other arrangements. But I would ask that you decide plainly and soon, because we have traveled a long way to be told plainly what we are worth." The town of Millbrook had gathered by then, drawn by the stagecoach, and the spectacle of 4 brothers standing frozen before 4 women who had clearly not planned to arrive together, but seemed entirely unsurprised to find themselves doing so. A woman near the mercantile whispered something behind her hand to the man beside her, and Jedediah caught enough of it to know the town would be talking about this for a week, regardless of what he decided. He looked at his brothers. Silas gave a small nod. Amos shrugged, which from Amos counted as enthusiastic agreement. Bartholomew had not stopped looking at Sue. "Well," Jedediah said finally, and something in his chest loosened despite the strangeness of the moment. "I reckon 4 brothers and 4 sisters is a sight tidier than what we planned, even if none of us planned it this way. Welcome to Millbrook, all of you." But even as he said it, he noticed the way Leanne's gaze moved past him, toward the edge of the gathered crowd, and settled for one uneasy second on a man in a gray coat who was watching the sisters with far too much interest for a stranger, before the man turned and disappeared into the alley beside the mercantile. Jedediah did not know it yet, but that man had been asking questions about the Voss ranch for 2 days, and the answers he wanted had nothing to do with cattle. Loading the trunks took the better part of an hour, 4 heavy cases apiece, packed with what little the sisters had managed to carry across an ocean and then a continent. Jedediah found himself lifting Leanne's trunk before he thought to ask, and she let him, watching his face the whole time as though gauging something in the way he handled another person's belongings. It was, he would realize later, the first test of many, though she never called it that outright. "You're stronger than your letters suggested," she said, when he set the trunk down without strain in the wagon bed. "Letters don't carry weight the way a body does," Jedediah said. "Figured actions would tell you more than words could." "That is a rare belief for a man to hold," Leanne said, and something in her tone suggested she intended to test whether he held it consistently, not just on the first afternoon, when everyone watching still mattered. The wagon ride out to the ranch took the better part of the afternoon, and Jedediah found himself seated beside Leanne on the bench, while his brothers rode ahead with the trunks, each pairing off in a rough, unspoken arrangement that seemed to sort itself without a single word of negotiation. Silas rode near Yoon's window. Amos kept pace beside Fenn's side of the wagon bed. Bartholomew, predictably, could not stop finding reasons to ride close to where Sue sat. "Your sister mentioned you traveled a long way," Jedediah said, mostly to fill the silence, though he found he wanted the answer more than he expected to. "From San Francisco," Leanne said. "Before that, from a village outside Canton, though that was some years back. Our father worked the rail lines until the work ran out, and after he passed, there was little keeping 4 sisters in a city that had little use for us, beyond what men wanted to pay for." "I'm sorry for your father," Jedediah said. "He would have liked this country," Leanne said, looking out at the grassland rolling toward the mountains. "He always said land was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen outright, only fought over slow." "He wasn't wrong," Jedediah said, and something in the plainness of her observation settled a knot in his chest he had not known was there. "This ranch has been fought over slow more than once." Leanne turned to look at him properly for the first time since the wagon left town. "What do you mean by that?" Jedediah hesitated, unsure how much to say to a woman he had known for the length of an afternoon, but something about her steady patience made the words come easier than he expected. "There's a man named Otto Pruitt runs the freight line through this valley. Wanted to buy our water rights 3 years back, the spring that feeds our lower pasture. My father refused him before he passed, and Pruitt's been circling ever since, buying up smaller claims around us, waiting for the day we're weak enough to sell." "And are you weak?" Leanne asked, without a trace of insult in the question, only genuine curiosity. "We were 4 bachelor brothers running a ranch built for a family twice our size," Jedediah said. "Pruitt's men have been telling folks in town we won't last another winter without wives to keep the house and hands to help the work. Figured they'd wait us out." "Then perhaps 4 sisters arriving all at once was not merely inconvenient timing," Leanne said, and there was something almost dry in her voice, a small private amusement that surprised him. Perhaps it was exactly inconvenient enough for Mr. Pruitt. Jedediah found himself smiling despite the weight of the conversation, the first real smile he could remember in months. "Ma'am, I have a feeling you're going to be inconvenient for a great many people around here, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." The road climbed gently as they went, the town giving way to open range, and Leanne watched the country pass with an attention Jedediah found himself watching rather than the road. She noted the fence lines, the condition of the grass, the way the creek ran low for the season. "Your cattle graze this pasture through summer," she said, not quite a question. "Lower pasture till the frost, then we move them up toward the timberline," Jedediah said, surprised she'd guessed the pattern from fence alone. My father managed rail crews, Leon said. You learn to read land quick when men's wages depend on how well you understand what the ground will and won't give you. She looked at him sideways. This land will give plenty, if it's managed with patience. You strike me as a patient man, Mr. Voss. Trying to be, Jedediah admitted. Some days easier than others. The ranch house came into view as the sun dropped low over the western ridge, a sprawling, clapboard structure with a wraparound porch that Jedediah's father had built with his own hands 3 decades before, back when the Voss family had been larger and the Winters had claimed more than their share of it. The 4 brothers had spent the past month scrubbing and repairing rooms that had sat empty since their mother's passing, and Jedediah watched Leon's face carefully as she took in the house, searching for some sign of judgment or disappointment. Instead, she simply nodded, the way a person nods at a fact rather than an opinion. It is a good house. It will be a better one with work. That first evening, the 8 of them sat around a table built for a family that no longer existed in its original form, and Jedediah watched something remarkable happen. His brothers, who had spent the ride home mostly silent, found their tongues over supper, laughing at Amos's terrible attempt to describe the ranch's cattle count in numbers that kept changing with each telling, while Sue corrected Bartholomew's grammar with a patience that made the younger man flush red to the ears. Yun, quieter than her sisters, asked Silas pointed questions about the barn's construction that made him talk more in one meal than Jedediah had heard from him in a month. It did not feel, Jedediah thought, like 8 strangers thrown together by circumstance and an ocean crossing. It felt, improbably, like the beginning of something that might actually hold. After supper, while the brothers cleared the table in a clumsy imitation of hospitality none of them had practiced in years, Fenn wandered out to the kitchen garden plot behind the house, overgrown and neglected since their mother's passing, and stood there a long while in the fading light. Amos found her there. Ground's gone hard, Fenn said, crouching to test the soil between her fingers. But it's not dead. Just needs turning before the season's fully gone. Nobody's touched it in 3 years, Amos admitted. Didn't have the knack for it, truth told. I do, Fenn said simply, and something about the plain confidence of it made Amos smile for the first time all evening. But 2 nights later, the barn caught fire. Jedediah woke to the smell of smoke and Silas's voice shouting from the yard, and by the time he reached the barn, flames had already climbed halfway up the eastern wall, close enough to the hay store that the whole structure would be gone within the hour if nobody acted. Amos was already dragging the water barrel toward the blaze, and Bartholomew had thrown open the stall doors to drive the horses clear, their eyes rolling white with panic in the firelight. What Jedediah did not expect was Leanne, still in her night clothes, with a shawl thrown hastily over her shoulders, organizing a bucket line from the well with a calm authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. Yun, Finn, form the line here. Sue, keep the horses moving away from the smoke. Do not let them circle back toward the barn, no matter how they fight you. She turned to Jedediah, soot already streaking one cheek. Is there a fire break dug anywhere near the hay store? No, Jedediah admitted, passing buckets as fast as his arms could manage. Then we need to pull the loose hay clear of the fire's path before it reaches the store, or we lose the whole winter's feed along with the barn. She was already moving as she spoke, grabbing a pitchfork from where it leaned against the fence, and working alongside Silas to drag burning straw away from the stacked bales, her hands moving with a competence that told Jedediah this was not the first fire she had fought in her life. The heat pressed against them in waves, and twice Jedediah felt the sting of a spark landing against his forearm, but he did not stop, and neither did anyone else. Sue fought the horses back from the smoke with a low, steady voice that seemed to calm even the most panicked of them, while Yoon and Finn passed buckets down the line so fast the water sloshed more onto the ground than the flames, though it was enough, together with the wet sacking Silas threw over the worst of the blaze, to keep it from climbing further. They worked through the better part of an hour, the 8 of them moving as though they had trained together for years rather than days, and by the time the flames finally guttered into smoking ruin, the barn's frame had survived, scorched but standing, and the hay store had been saved entire. Jedediah stood in the gray light before dawn, his arms aching, his lungs raw with smoke, and watched Leanne direct Finn in checking the horses for burns with the same steady command she had shown throughout, and understood that whatever he had imagined a mail-order bride might be, it had not been anything close to this. "You fought fire before," he said, when the worst of the danger had passed, and the others had drifted toward the house to wash the soot from their hands. "Rail camps burn," Leanne said simply. "Wooden barracks, dry season, careless men with lanterns. You learn quick or you lose everything." She looked at the scorched barn wall, then at him. "This fire did not start from a lantern, Mr. Voss. There was no lantern in your barn tonight. I checked before I woke your brothers." Jedediah felt the cold certainty of her words settle into his stomach. "You're saying somebody set it?" "I am saying a barn that has stood 30 years without burning does not choose the third night after 4 sisters arrive to catch fire on its own," Leanne said. "I am saying your Mr. Pruitt may have decided that inconvenient timing deserves an inconvenient answer." They found the proof the following morning, a scorched coal oil tin half buried near the barn's eastern wall, far from where any lantern would reasonably have hung, and Jedediah felt the last of his patience with Otto Pruitt burn away along with the barn's eastern wall. Silas turned the tin over in his hands, studying the maker's stamp pressed into the metal. "This came from the mercantile in town. Only one place sells this brand out here." "And somebody bought it recent," Amos said. "Store clerk keeps a ledger. Might remember who." But it was Leanne who suggested they say nothing publicly yet, who suggested instead they watch and wait, because a man who set fires in the dark was a man who would eventually make a mistake in the light, and she intended to be standing there when he did. "A man who moves too quick after being caught only warns his enemy to hide better," she said. "Better he believes we suspect nothing until the moment we can prove everything." The days that followed carried a strange, uneasy rhythm. Ordinary ranch work laid over a current of watchfulness that none of them spoke of openly, but all of them felt. Jedediah found himself checking the tree line more often than usual, and he noticed Leanne doing the same, though she never mentioned it aloud. The rebuilding of the barn's eastern wall gave them cover for extra vigilance, since fresh lumber needed hauling, and fresh eyes on the property raised no suspicion. It was during this stretch of days that Jedediah first noticed how thoroughly his brothers had begun to change. Silas, always the quietest, spent his evenings teaching Yoon the particulars of the ranch's account books, and she picked up the figures faster than he had, correcting an error in the previous year's tally that had gone unnoticed for months. Amos and Finn turned the kitchen garden into a small, thriving plot within 2 weeks, the two of them arguing companionably over whether beans or squash deserved the better soil, an argument that seemed to bring them both more joy than either would admit outright. Bartholomew, still the most transparent of the 4 brothers, found excuse after excuse to walk the fence lines with Sue, and came back each evening a little more talkative than the last. The private conversation that mattered most happened on the porch, after supper, a week after the fire, when Jedediah found Leanne alone, mending a torn sleeve by lamplight with the same steady patience she brought to everything. "You never asked me why I answered your advertisement," she said, before he had settled into the chair beside her. Most men assume desperation, poverty, a woman with no other prospects. Wasn't going to assume anything, Jedediah said. Figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know. Leanne set down her mending and looked at him directly, the lamplight catching the tiredness she usually kept hidden behind competence. Our mother died on the crossing from China before I was old enough to remember her clearly. Our father raised 4 daughters alone in a country that had little patience for either fact that he was a widower or that his children were girls. When he passed, the men who came asking after us were not offering marriage. They were offering arrangements far uglier than that word suggests. Her hands, Jedediah noticed, had gone still in her lap. I answered every advertisement I could find that mentioned land and honest work, because land cannot be taken back once it is deeded, and honest work is the only inheritance my father ever managed to leave us. I did not come here for romance, Mr. Voss. I came here so that my sisters would never again have to wonder what a man wanted from them before he wanted anything else. Jedediah sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into him slow and complete. I won't pretend I know what that crossing cost you, he said finally, but I can tell you this ranch is deeded free and clear, has been since my father's day, and nothing Otto Pruitt or any man like him does is going to change that while I'm still breathing. You and your sisters aren't an arrangement to me anymore, Leanne. Haven't been since the barn fire, if I'm honest. Watching you organize 8 people into saving a winter's feed while half asleep, that told me plain what kind of woman I'd been lucky enough to write letters to. Lucky, Leanne repeated, something almost like a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. That is not a word I expected from a man who spent his whole first evening looking like he'd swallowed his own tongue. Ma'am, I've been recalculating my luck every day since that stagecoach door opened, Jedediah said, and when she laughed, quiet and real, he understood he had said exactly the right thing. They sat a while longer in a silence that had turned comfortable rather than uncertain, and Leanne told him, in pieces, about the crossing itself, the weeks below deck with her sisters, the fear of arriving to find the letters had lied, the relief when they had not. Jedediah found himself telling her, in turn, about his father's death, about the winter that had nearly broken all 4 brothers before they thought to write those advertisements, about the particular loneliness of a house built for more people than it held. Neither of them spoke of the fire again that night, though both knew the danger had not passed, only paused. The second and larger threat arrived 4 days later, when Otto Pruitt himself rode out to the ranch, flanked by 2 hired men, and found all 8 of the ranch's occupants gathered in the yard, having anticipated exactly this visit since the coal oil tin was found. Pruitt was a heavy-set man with a politeness that Jedediah had learned over 3 years of dealing with him to trust less than open hostility. "Voss," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "heard about your barn fire. Terrible thing. Careless with lanterns, I expect, this time of year." "There was no lantern near that fire, Mr. Pruitt," Jedediah said. "We found the coal oil tin that started it, half buried, like whoever set it meant to come back for it later and didn't get the chance." Something flickered across Pruitt's face, gone almost before it arrived. "Serious accusation to make without proof." "We have the tin," Leanne said, stepping forward before Jedediah could answer, and Jedediah watched Pruitt's eyes narrow at the sight of a woman speaking first, in a conversation he had clearly intended to have only with men. "We also have a witness from town who saw a man matching the description of one of your hired hands purchasing coal oil the same afternoon the fire was set, though he told the store clerk it was for his own lamp. We have not yet taken either matter to the territorial marshal, Mr. Pruitt, but we intend to, unless the water rights dispute that has been simmering between your freight line and this family for 3 years finds itself settled plainly and permanently in the Voss family's favor." Pruitt's polite mask slipped fully then, revealing something colder underneath. "You'd have a foreign woman speak for you, Voss." "I'd have the smartest person in this yard speak for all of us," Jedediah said, and he felt his brothers close ranks beside him without needing to be asked. Silas and Amos and Bartholomew forming a line as solid as the one Pruitt's own hired men had formed behind him. "And I'd remind you, Pruitt, that threatening a family's water rights with fire is the kind of crime that gets a man's freight contracts pulled by the territorial court quicker than any lawsuit over property lines ever could. You want to test whether the marshal finds that coal oil tin as convincing as we do, you're welcome to ride into town and find out. Otherwise, I suggest you ride home and reconsider whatever plan you had for waiting us out." One of Pruitt's hired men shifted uneasily in his saddle, and Jedediah marked the man's face, certain now he had found the fellow who bought the coal oil under a false excuse. Pruitt noticed the look too, and something in his composure cracked further, a bead of sweat tracking down from beneath his hat despite the cool of the evening. The standoff held for a long, taut moment, the only sound the wind moving through the grass and the horses shifting nervous at the tension in the yard, until Pruitt, calculating the odds the way men like him always did, decided the risk of exposure outweighed whatever satisfaction remained in pressing the matter further. He turned his horse without another word and rode back toward town, his hired men falling in behind him, and Jedediah felt the whole yard exhale at once. "That won't be the end of it," Silas said quietly, watching them go. "No," Leanne agreed, "but it will make him careful, and careful men make mistakes trying not to make mistakes. We wait, we watch, and we make certain the marshal already knows our names as honest people before Pruitt ever gets the chance to make us out as something else." That very week, Jedediah rode into town with Leanne beside him and gave a full account to the territorial marshal, a weathered man named Everett Doyle, who had dealt with Pruitt's freight line disputes before and did not seem surprised in the least by the accusation. Doyle took the coal oil tin into evidence, along with the mercantile clerk's recollection of the purchase, and promised to keep a quiet watch on Pruitt's dealings going forward. It was not justice delivered swift, but it was justice set in motion, and that, Leanne told Jedediah on the ride home, was often the only kind available to people without money or standing to hurry it along. 3 months passed, and the Voss ranch that had once housed 4 bachelor brothers eating burnt supper over an empty table had become something Jedediah barely recognized, and treasured all the more for the unfamiliarity of it. The barn had been rebuilt, its eastern wall stronger than the original, framed with Silas and Yun working side by side through the worst of the summer heat, since it turned out Yun had a steadier hand with a hammer than any of the brothers had expected to find in a bride. Amos and Finn had turned the kitchen garden into something that fed the whole household with vegetables enough to trade in town, a small but steady income that Finn managed with a ledger book she kept as carefully as any bank clerk. Bartholomew and Sue had settled into an easy partnership over the ranch's small herd of dairy cattle, and their laughter, Jedediah noticed, had become the most constant sound in the house. Otto Pruitt's freight contracts had indeed drawn the territorial marshal's attention that autumn, after a second family further up the valley reported a suspiciously similar barn fire, and the coal oil tin the Voss family had preserved as evidence proved instrumental in the case that eventually saw Pruitt's hired man convicted of arson and Pruitt himself stripped of 2 of his most profitable freight routes for failing to control his own employees. He did not trouble the Voss ranch again, and word in town shifted, slowly but surely, from suspicion of the 4 foreign sisters who had arrived so strangely to quiet respect for a family that had weathered fire and threat alike without breaking. By the time autumn's first frost touched the high pasture, The ranch had grown in ways none of the brothers could have predicted 3 months before. The dairy herd Bartholomew and Sue tended had doubled in size through careful breeding, and the milk and cheese they traded in town had become reliable enough that the general store kept a standing order. The garden Finn and Amos had coaxed back to life fed not only the household, but 2 neighboring families through a lean stretch of the season, cementing goodwill that would matter for years to come. Silas and Ewan's careful management of the account books had uncovered enough hidden savings and corrected errors that the ranch could finally afford new fencing along its western boundary, closing off the last vulnerable stretch where Pruitt's cattle had once strayed onto Voss land under convenient excuses. On a warm evening in late summer, Jedediah found Leanne on the porch where he had first learned the truth of why she had crossed an ocean, and he sat beside her the way he had come to do most evenings, watching the sun drop behind the ridge that had once seemed, to 4 lonely bachelor brothers, like the edge of an empty world. "I have been thinking," Leanne said, "that when the stagecoach door opened that first day, I expected to find one man willing to honor a stranger's letter. I did not expect to find a whole family willing to make room for 4 sisters who arrived as an inconvenience nobody had planned for." "Wasn't an inconvenience," Jedediah said. "It was the best surprise this ranch has had since my father built it." He took her hand, calloused now from 3 months of shared work, and found he no longer thought of her hands as delicate or foreign, only as familiar and necessary as his own. "I love you, Leanne. Not because the arrangement worked out convenient, though I reckon it did. Because you stepped off that stagecoach and decided before you even knew our names proper that you'd rather fight for a hard life honestly than accept an easy one built on somebody else's terms. Never met anybody like that before you." "I love you too, Jedediah," Leanne said, and the words carried none of the careful formality of her letters, only the plain, settled certainty of a woman who had found at last the land her father always said could not be stolen outright. "I did not cross an ocean looking for romance. I found a home instead, and a family large enough to hold 4 sisters who never again have to wonder what they are worth." Below the porch, the sound of Bartholomew's laughter carried from the barn where he and Sue were finishing the evening chores, and somewhere near the garden fence, Amos and Finn argued cheerfully over next season's planting, while Silas and Ewan sat with the account books between them, their heads bent close together over figures that no longer troubled either of them the way they once had. Past the ridge, the last light of a Wyoming summer settled gold over land that 8 people, once strangers bound by nothing more than a stranger's letter and a long ocean crossing, now called simply and completely their own. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button, and if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.